I welcome you all for attending this session. So it's a session on understanding the impact of national refugee status determination systems on international protection. It's two lectures, two presentations on Europe rather, although Pierre is also extending to South Africa, Canada in his analysis. And then we have Craig, who will present the more an American perspective to this topic. If I'm not wrong, Pierre will be the first one to present something. So this is papers which are part of the work package 3 of PROTECT, which is focusing on the asylum architecture. And so I'll give first the floor to Pierre Van Wolleghem. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Milan in Italy, and he is at the moment a postdoctoral fellow at University of Bergen, and he is having a quantitative methodological approach to the issue of this asylum architecture, and I will give him the floor. Pierre, it's yours now. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start. I will share my screen. Just give me a sec. There is a longer version of this presentation on the website, so I'm going to be very to the point in this presentation, and I'm not going to go too much into details. So this part of the research project regards explaining variation in refugee recognition rates, and it gives particular emphasis on the refugee status determination architectures. So okay, so the very basis of this research project lies with the fact that a lot of the refugee determination architecture lies with the legal and administrative machinery of the states, which is basically the system, the machinery that transforms asylum applications, like a variety of individual situations, into binary outcomes. Either protection is granted or it is not. And so the goal of this part of the PROTECT research project is to look into this box that legal and administrative machinery of the state is, and to see how this affects recognition rates of protection statuses. So in this presentation, I'm going to walk you through the reasoning that we've conducted so far, and I'm going to present some of the preliminary results that we've reached recently. Can you hear me fine? Yeah? Okay. So on this graph, you don't see all the sources of variation that there is in recognition rates, but in the presentation that is online in the little recording, you see in more detail that there is a great variation over time. There is a great variation in terms of countries of origin, and great variation from one country of asylum to another. And so the purpose of this research is to, let me see, it doesn't go forward. Okay, is to explain why there is such variation in recognition rates. So in substance, the question is, why is it that applicants with similar characteristics have different chances to be granted protection if they apply in one country or another? So there have been many different hypotheses put to the test in the literature. We've had hypotheses relating to migration, such as the share of foreign population, number of asylum claims, and so on. We've had economics-related explanations, also politics-related explanations. But we have very little studies that look into the refugee status determination features in a comparative perspective. So this is what we're going to do, what we've started to do, what we're going to do for some more time. So the idea is to look at recognition rates for convention status, so the refugee status, for other statuses, other protection statuses, and for all those statuses put together as recognition of protection rate, protection recognition rate. So of course, we factor in the economics factors, we factor in the sending country factors, political factors, and to this, we add refugee status determination architectures. So what do we mean by refugee status determination architectures? We mean everything that relates to the normal asylum procedure. And here we have, for instance, governance structures, whether applicants have access to legal and interpretation assistance, whether they have a right to appeal decisions, whether this appeal is suspensive. Another component that we have to look into is how applicants are accessing to the normal asylum procedure. And here we have everything that regards the admissibility grounds, what the decision-making process is, whether applicants have a right to challenge that kind of decisions. To those two spheres, we have to add the detention procedures, which may affect both the normal asylum procedure and the access to normal asylum procedure, and therefore recognition rates, and also the rights of refugees and other protected people. As more generous, let's say, countries, when it comes to rights, may be more inclined to limit access to the refugee status, or limit the recognition of the status. And here we look into the length of residence permits, rights to family reunification, whether they have access to language tuition or other social and educational benefits. So we're currently in the process of collecting data along 4 dimensions. So we have detention, admissibility, normal procedures, and rights, and to which we add also vulnerabilities. We emphasize governance structures. We cover 15 EU countries or European countries, plus Canada and South Africa over 20 years. So that's a lot of work of data collection that results in about like 1,500 variables to code and aggregate. So that's still a work in progress. Hopefully will be done soon, but that's quite a big work. So we don't have final results, but we have some preliminary analysis that we've run on, let's say, macro features. And here we've looked at the effect of administrative capacity and also its experience in asylum matters on recognition rates, together with the effect of politics, which may affect the administration's ability to carry out its own task. What we consider administration capacity is basically the procedural certainty, the accountability, the predictability, and the independence from politics for the administration. As for experience, we consider as experience the development of a dense set of rules on asylum matters through exposure. And here exposure is mostly the influxes of asylum seekers in the 1990s. Yeah. So we look at what the effect of developed administration and experience is on recognition rates, and also the effect of government positions. So that's a quantitative study. I'm not going to go too much into the technical details. You have a couple of frames underneath if you want to check it out. But just to focus on the little results that we've obtained so far, we can see that administrative capacity and exposure have a combined effect on refugee recognition rates, namely that at high levels of exposure, recognition rates increases as administrative capacity increases. So that's the curve at the bottom that you see here, like the positive curve at the bottom. And you see on the other side that at low exposure, recognition rates decreases as administrative capacity increases. So you can see it here with the downwards curve. Differently, we also see that government position on migration has an effect that is, however, mitigated by administrative capacity. And here, this is the curve you see about here. And you see that the effect of government preferences on refugee recognition rates decreases with higher levels of administrative capacity. And you see also that this effect is no longer significant where administrative capacity reaches a certain level. So those are preliminary results. I rushed a little bit through the presentation just to make sure that everyone has time enough to present their own research. I hope this was good enough for you to have questions and maybe points of reflections on it. Thank you very much.
Okay, Pierre, you went really quick. You needed less than 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So I propose we do the 3 sessions and then we have questions and answers. So this is the quantitative approach of the PROTECT research on the importance of institutional architecture. We have also a qualitative approach. And for this, we have Eva Ecker from the University of Ghent, who has a degree in social work and in public and a master's degree in public administration. So she's a PhD student and she will present her findings now. So I'll give her the floor. Eva, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. So today I will be talking about the influence of institutional architecture on the outcome of refugee status determination for the cases Belgium and the Netherlands. First, I will say something about refugee statuses, and next I will focus on the institutional architecture of asylum institutions. So refugee statuses, when we look back at the moment when the EU wasn't yet a part of refugee statuses, we can see that there were 2 kinds of refugee statuses in Europe. The first was the convention refugee status, which was an international status, a very strong one, which generated a lot of rights and was hard to revoke. However, multiple countries felt threatened in their sovereignty, so that's why they came up with own national de facto refugee statuses, which were less strong and easier to revoke. But in that way, countries could still comply with the non-refoulement obligation, meaning that it was not allowed to send people back to their countries of origin where they were persecuted. And with our research, we are trying to find out whether it is a good thing for the overall refugee protection regime to have multiple protection statuses. And we are doing so by comparing the cases Belgium and the Netherlands between 1974 and 1991, because then Belgium only had 1 refugee status, the convention refugee status, while the Netherlands also had other multiple de facto refugee statuses. And we see that 2 situations can happen. And the first situation that could happen is that multiple protection statuses were detrimental for refugee protection, as de facto refugee statuses could hollow out the convention refugee status, thus enhancing a restrictive application of the convention refugee status. However, something else could happen, and that is that multiple protection statuses were beneficial for refugee protection, as they kind of serve as a safety net, at least offering some protection instead of no protection at all. And we have some preliminary results already. The first is for Iranian asylum seekers. And here we see that in Belgium, more people got recognized as a refugee than in the Netherlands. So when we look at these numbers, we could say that the first hypothesis applies, that more refugee statuses were detrimental for refugee protection. However, we need to say that we do not know for sure exactly how many people got the de facto status or status in appeal. However, we have reasons to assume that it won't be more than 73%. And the Belgian numbers are more certain because at that time there was no appeal available in Belgium. The second example is for the Sri Lankan asylum seekers. And here we see that in the Netherlands, more people got recognized, but that's only possible because of the existence of the de facto statuses, because if it weren't for the de facto statuses, very few people would have gotten recognized. So when we see these numbers, it seems that our second hypothesis applies, that more refugee statuses were beneficial for refugee protection. So we need to do more research for now. We need to collect more data and look into other possible elements that could play a role in this. And then our second question is about the institutional architecture of asylum institutions. And here we see that the Netherlands and Belgium have a whole other asylum system. And the most important thing I want to elaborate on are these arrows. The arrows, the light blue arrows in the Netherlands mean that the Ministry of Justice gave the asylum decision task through the Immigration Office and more the Asylum Department through classical delegation. So the decision stays within the ministry, while in Belgium we see another kind of arrow, and that means that the Ministry of Internal Affairs kind of outsourced the decision to an independent state agency. So it's another way of organizing the asylum decision. And two things could happen here. So we have two possible hypotheses. And the first one is that if there is no institutional independence, contamination is possible. So these little wheels present contamination, meaning that the refugee protection mission could possibly be contaminated by other interests, for example, political interests from the Ministry of Justice, while in Belgium the sole mission is to protect refugees. And the second hypothesis, however, is that organizational independence can serve as a shield against contamination, meaning that maybe there are several mechanisms that protect the Dutch refugee protection mission as well. So those are our two possibilities. We also have some preliminary results. For the Netherlands, we see that there is a protective shield in the asylum department. So there are mechanisms that protect the refugee protection mission. However, we also see some contamination, creating some holes in the protective shields. And that is, for example, the asylum department has to take into account some political sensitivities. And also the temporary staff within the asylum department for coping with the sudden increase of asylum application is staffed with people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Removal and Return Office. And this can be possibly problematic because these people have another perspective, are used to looking at our target group at a whole other way. So that might compromise the refugee protection mission. And when we look at Belgium, we do not know for sure yet, but our most results indicate a protective shield protecting the refugee mission. However, there are some results that might indicate contamination, but we need to look more into this. So thank you. This was my presentation.
Okay, Eva, thank you very much for your presentation. So this is another approach to the similar question as Pierre indicated. It's both within project. We have a quantitative historical approach, a qualitative historical approach and a quantitative approach, both on the long term about the development of asylum institutions and their performance. We have also today with us Craig Damian Smith, who is an expert on Schengen agreement. So he's very knowledgeable about the European side, but now he's working on the situation on the American continent. So he works now he's a senior research associate at the Ryerson University at the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration. He's also, just like Pierre, a political scientist. So he worked on the Schengen Agreement, but now he works about what happens on the American continent, but I'll give him the floor. You can use a bit more than 10 minutes because Pierre and Eva have limited their presentation to less than 10 minutes. So I would give you some more time for your presentation about the situation on the American continent. I give you the floor. Great.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to just to preface by saying that I'm not so much looking at asylum, but looking at international cooperation and responsibility sharing, though asylum capacity building is part of that. So as you mentioned, I'm a political scientist, and mostly I look at international migration through an international relations lens, specifically looking at mixed migration flows, border controls, and how international cooperation or the lack thereof affects security situations in host and transit states and around borders. So I'm looking at the power politics of the implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees in Central America, host states containment, and the absence of international resettlement. And this is a chapter in a special journal issue that we have coming out in the journal, which I'm co-editing, guest editing, the Journal of Immigration and Refugee Studies. And the topic of the special issue is new research agendas for migration and asylum in the Americas. So just as a bit of an overview, because we've mostly been looking at the European context, I'm looking at the displacement crises and their knock-on effects that are happening in what we call the Northern Triangle of Central America countries. That's El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The displacement numbers in the region are relatively low, but the political effects of them are quite high in comparison to Europe. So there's about 400,000 people displaced in neighboring countries and another 500,000 displaced internationally. The majority of these people, unlike people who are fleeing Venezuela, end up in Mexico, the US, or Canada. There's also complex mixed migration dynamics in the region. There's 3 to 4 million internally displaced people in these countries, and on average, people are displaced twice before they flee internationally. We also have the well-publicized caravans, and in the recent years, things have been changing quite a bit. Sorry, I just forgot to turn on my timer. The big changes that we're seeing now is that there's a 20-year high of people arriving at the US-Mexico border. So, in 2015, the refugee crisis that almost brought down the Schengen area, which is 1 million people arriving, that a commensurate number is arriving at the US-Mexico border in 2021. Another big change is that the majority of the people trying to cross the border, whether claiming asylum or clandestinely or just seeking other forms of entry, are predominantly now Central Americans, whereas in the past they were Mexican. We also see more deportations from Mexico to Guatemala than from the US to Mexico for the first time ever. And then we also see increased transnational mixed migration through the region. This project, the idea for this project started through observations from a previous project, which was about asylum seekers transiting through the US and arriving in Canada. And for that project, we interviewed a few hundred of these people to understand their route choices and determinants. And the important thing to notice from this graph is the yellow sections of these bars are asylum seekers arriving in Canada from Latin America and the Caribbean. And as you can see, as a proportion of the overall asylum claims in Canada, they've increased tremendously and also in real terms. Yet, at the same time, and this is the second observation, Canada, which prides itself and is kind of lauded as this international leader on resettlement, resettles basically no one from the region. So we have these mixed migration dynamics, these increased displacement crises in the region, and it's in Canada's backyard, yet Canada functionally ignores resettlement from Latin America and the Caribbean, which is puzzling both from a humanitarian perspective, but also from a self-interested perspective, because we understand that resettlement and offering additional pathways is one way that states think about attenuating irregular migration crises, which can be politically damaging for countries. This is a map that we developed from our interviews with people who were arriving in Canada. And one of the important things to note here is that people who can get US visas chose to fly directly to the US and then transit to Canada over this area called Roxham Road here on the New York-Quebec border from 2016 to 2020 until the COVID-19 pandemic closed the border. But increasingly, more and more people are traveling from predominantly South Asia and Africa and arriving in different parts of Latin America, whether it's Central America or South America, and joining established transnational mixed migration routes through the region, and with the intended goal of arriving in Canada, the US and Canada. In this context, we have the implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees in Central America. As we've been discussing over the past couple of days, the goal of the Global Compact on Refugees is to bolster international responsibility sharing as laid out in the convention and the norms of the regime. And in Central America, the implementation package of the GCR, which is called, there's always too many acronyms, the CRRF is implemented as a regional approach under the Spanish acronym MIRPS. And it's a regional approach from several countries that you can see there, including international donors. Canada is now the chair of the MIRPS process, the US, a large number of donor states from Europe, and it also includes UNHCR, IOM, and a range of other UN agencies in the region. Its fundamental goal is what it calls root causes approach. That's local integration, that's development of host states, and that's asylum capacity building. Yet, despite the goal of bolstering international responsibility sharing and the fact that both Canada and the US have, despite the Trump administration, have very well developed systems for international responsibility, for international resettlement as a mode of responsibility sharing, and indeed increasingly build their international reputation on those and try to export them to other countries, resettle no people from the region. So the goal of the CRRF here is containment in the region. So the question for me in preparing this paper was why? Why is that the case? And to do that, I use an international relations lens, and my fundamental argument is that we can't understand or analyze the implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees in Central America. We can't understand the lack of additionality as laid out in the compact, even though there are very specific mechanisms for resettlement that are unique to the GCR as it's implemented in Latin America, without understanding the history and power politics of the region. And I'm not sure if people were in the previous panel, the first panel today, but Madeline Garlick from UNHCR, I asked the question directly. In my opinion, the question was dodged, but we see that the CRRF and the way that it's implemented fits into this hierarchy that exists in North America and between North America and Central America. So we have a decades-long history of predating the Cold War, back to the Monroe Doctrine, of the U.S. exercising hegemony in the region and understanding it as its sphere of influence throughout the Cold War, but then also in the civil wars. You know, for instance, Guatemala had a 30-year civil war that displaced millions of people. The U.S. funded the wars there. There's the history of pushbacks of, for instance, Haitian boat people, et cetera, and regional approaches to containing refugees and asylum seekers on islands and extraterritorial processing. There's also the history after the Cold War of trade and neoliberalism under the Washington Consensus, and Latin America was the testing ground for most of that. The regional hierarchy and state self-interest has moved to containment instead of containment of communism, as was the case throughout the Cold War. It's now containment of refugees and migrants. And I lay this out in the paper, but essentially I analyze what we call allying and bandwagoning in international relations literature that states throughout the region bandwagon with the US for the so-called root causes approach. And if people are familiar, Canada and the US signed a safe third country agreement in 2004, which can send asylum seekers back from Canada to the US. And that was entirely, the goal of that was entirely to stop Central American asylum seekers from transiting through the US to Canada. So other states have self-interest in that. We also see weak regional governance regimes in North America. And my argument there is that where the hegemonic influence is the most significant in international regimes and in global governance, we see the weakest global governance regimes when it comes to migration, and a fundamental and very stark separation from rights-based mobility regimes that exist in South America. In addition, Latin America is the region with the highest proportion of signatories to the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and their Families, whereas Mexico and Canada have not signed that, like most global North states, like almost all European states and definitely all EU states. We also see this rapidly proliferating externalization, that's unilateral safe third country deals, border fortifications, funding third country security services, increased deportation regimes, and chain refoulement. And despite the fact that the Trump administration and their policies in the region took up a lot of oxygen, the paper charts this all the way from the first Bush presidency, Bush the first, through Clinton, through Bush again, through Obama, through Trump, and now through the Biden administration, that there's not just commonalities in their externalization and the way they do that, but that the impacts of those policies accelerate over time, despite the administration, despite, in America's broken bi-party system, basically party affiliation doesn't matter when it comes to the externalization. And in fact, democratic administrations have been better at externalization. And then finally, the paper looks at the ways in which different administrations work towards these externalization regimes through issue linkage, coercion, and compellence. So that's basically very similar to the way that the EU and EU member states partner with third countries for migration control deals or return and readmission agreements. Likewise, the US uses trade aid, investment, and mobility, whether it's carrots or sticks, and it's generally some combination thereof, to get third countries to get in line with their control agenda. And then so the big question I have, and the question for the conversation is what does this overarching structure of control and this accelerating structure of control mean for the Global Compact on Refugees in Latin America, given that responsibility sharing and especially resettlement as a durable solution is completely absent, empirically absent. It's impossible to argue that there's resettlement from Latin America because it's just not there, even very small complementary pathways. And how to understand the kind of the broader generalizable question is how to understand responsibility sharing under conditions of hegemony, whereas in Europe and its peripheries, for example, we have several cases where weaker countries or countries with less leverage are able to use coerced migration to leverage concessions out of the EU, like Turkey, like Libya, et cetera. And I'll just end on this quote. So when the Obama the Biden administration came in and was supposed to be a fundamental change from the Trump administration, Vice President Harriet's first trip was to Guatemala, where she said on a stage with the Guatemalan head of state, do not come. The US will continue to enforce our laws and secure our borders. And that was their message when it came to responsibility sharing for displacement crises in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture, which is another focus on this topic and on the Global Compact, of course. So, Pierre, you're following the questions.
I can start with a little question I have for Eva, if it's okay. Yeah. So that's actually a question I've been struggling with for a little while. How do you define institutional independence? For instance, I'm working on the Greek legal framework at the moment, and I see that, for instance, in the law of 2012, I think it is, Greece defines its new asylum service as being independent. But if you look at how they choose the head of the service, this is mostly the Ministry of the Interior that decides who is going to govern the whole organization. And I'm like, okay, so how independent is this? In other cases, for instance, I think it's the French example. You have like a fully fledged asylum agency that is supposed to be clearly independent from the Ministry of the Interior, but there are some connections between the two bodies. For instance, the Ministry of the Interior is still the one appointing the president of the OFPRA, if I'm correct. And you do have some other kind of connections between the two bodies. And so I was wondering how you would define institutional independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre, for this question. It's actually true that it's very hard to find out what is truly independence, because independence on paper is not always independence in practice. And in Belgium and the Netherlands, it's actually the same. So also the heads of the asylum institutions are politically appointed. So we can also look, for example, at the budgets to find out how independent they truly are. Also we can see if the mandate is prolonged or not, to see how independent they truly are, because we cannot know for sure just on paper. So it's actually we can mostly find out by talking and looking at NGO reports, for example, because by just looking at the system on paper, we surely cannot know for sure if some organization is truly independent. So I hope that answers your question. We are still in the middle of our research, so we still have to actually look a little bit more deeper into what is true independence. So we will take that into account. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can add something to this, Pierre, I think what Eva says indeed, how long is a mandate of the head of the asylum office? That's also, and can they easily be fired? That's, of course, as Eva said, an important indication of the independence of an institution. But I think this, what Eva is doing, is also looking into the way it has historically evolved and what this independence is meant in reality. So that's what she is doing in her research. Are there any other questions? Because I have some questions too for Pierre. Okay, so I have a question for Pierre about this. How do you do it? You have the period 2000-2020. How do you do it with, on slide 4, you had the convention status, and then you spoke of other protection statuses. There's a very important shift in other protection statuses in Europe, in the sense that you have subsidiary protection, which is imposed by European law. So do you consider it as a, how will you operationalize your work with this shifting field of protection statuses?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question, and actually, I had confirmation yesterday, an informal confirmation, that in many cases the authorities are reporting as other protection statuses that sometimes don't exist anymore. So that's extremely problematic. So the UNHCR is doing a tremendous work when it comes to gathering data, but most of the data infrastructure lies on willingness. So the states are more or less willing to report their protection data to UNHCR, and the convention apparently for this data sharing is very loose when it comes to what counts as other protection statuses. So yeah, I'm still not completely sure on how to go about that. Of course, the European Union subsidiary protection has to be considered. So this is something I'm planning to do, to compare the subsidiary protection figures with the complementary protection figures to see whether they match or whether they are correlated, so that we can kind of control this variety of statuses that you have in the let's say catch-all category that the complementary protection status is. So it's still a work in progress, actually.
Okay, so
I'm interested in why in the inclusion of Canada in the comparative example. Is that just because it's a Horizon 2020 grant and you have to put Canada in? Because Canada's, the tribunal system in Canada has an administrative, and this is another area of research that I'm working on currently on access to justice, is that A, there's publicly funded legal representation for the majority of refugee claimants, and B, that it's a largely non-politicized administrative tribunal that's non-adversarial, which is fundamentally different from most of the EU countries. So I'm wondering about how comparative it actually is.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, it's very interesting to read about this non-adversarial process in evaluating asylum claims in Canada. And actually, this is why it's so important to have countries like Canada in the bunch, because they represent some more variety in ways things are being done when it comes to assessing asylum applications. For instance, as you say, it's not so much of a controversial issue in Canada, or maybe not always a controversial topic. So this is interesting also to see there how the interaction between politics and administration is going to work out when it comes to recognition rates. So this is actually a way to increase the variability that we have in our data, to have like more points of reference, so that we can have like sounder conclusions at the end of the day, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. I have a question. If there are any questions, there's a question from J.C. Simon. So about the acceptance rates, different levels of appeal they have. So at which level of acceptance do you count your acceptance rates? Your recognition rates, are they including appeal decisions?
Is it a question for me? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a question for you. Yeah.
So once again, the analysis is only as good as the data. So that's always very problematic, because countries don't have obligations when it comes to the way they transfer their data. So in many cases, we do have to merge data on first instance and data on appeal, and that's quite problematic. This is why when we code the different legal frameworks, we pay particular attention on the actors that are involved, on the rights that the applicants have when it comes to appeal their first instance decision, and so on. So yeah, that's a very tricky question. Unfortunately, UNHCR's data is not always, it doesn't always allow this differentiation between between last instance and first instance. So yeah, that's a bit of a problem.
There is high quality data in Canada from the Immigration and Refugee Board.
Yeah, the problem
yeah.
is to have comparable data. If you take the Canadian one, then it's not going to be comparable to what you have in France or in Italy, for instance. And UNHCR provides this comparative basis because it's all gathered in a more or less similar way. So yeah, I agree with you. Like at the national level, you have much better statistics than at the international level. But
yeah, I think it's also interesting to we work together, Eva, I, and Pierre, on the figures too. So we're very critical towards the use of figures just like that. We in our qualitative research, we look into those figures, how they are constructed, and we feed our information to Pierre, so to look carefully to the figures he uses, so how they're being constructed too. And of course, this problem with the appeal procedures is a very difficult one because they are generated by other organizations and mostly have only the figures of the first instance asylum officers, at least in Europe. I have a question for Greg too. In the first session this morning, you asked about the importance of asylum institution building. No, you spoke about the situation in Middle America, and you asked the representative of UNHCR if this whole global compact and its use in Middle America is only in a containment policy, and she answered that it's important also that those countries build up their asylum institutions. What's your opinion about this answer? How can you integrate this in your model?
Yeah, my opinion is that the Global Compact on Refugees, and especially its implementation through the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which includes the asylum capacity building, is a recognition first that containment is the logic. And then, so what do we do if containment is the logic, and UNHCR as an institution, which is obviously hampered by A, its mandate, B, the member states and donor states, right? It has to be reactive to that, which is why, for instance, it gives opinions on signing safe country declarations, even though it says, please don't do that, please don't externalize, but if you do that, here's the best way to do it. And so I know the US, the Canada-Mexico case well, where there's the COMAR, which is the Mexican asylum agency, has extremely low capacity. And Canada talks about its contribution to the Global Compact in Mexico as providing this capacity building. And then when you dig into the budgets, you know, it was like, I think like $85,000, and they sent to Immigration and Refugee Board decision makers there and are helping them translate some country profiles and things of this nature. So the notion, and again, comparative to the European example where it says, okay, well, we won't send people back until, you know, the countries that we send them back to are commensurate to the protections that they would receive in Europe, right? That's lip service, but then you look at the functional capacity in comparison to the number of asylum seekers who are there, the need, and it seems to be an afterthought. So to answer the question, my reaction was that's typically what we would hear from UNHCR, but if it were a closed door conversation, I assume the answer would have been different and maybe more honest.
It's time to close. I want to thank the three people who presented their paper here for their contribution. And I thought we had an interesting conversation. The time was short, but now we have to go back to the general room for the concluding session of this seminar. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you hopefully later in the same PROTECT conferences. Goodbye.